Getting the snare right is arguably the most important part of the mix and can also be the most difficult part. In this clip, Josh talks about his preference to tracking drums and how his method of dry tracking gives him more control in the mix. You'll also see a cool way he converts audio to MIDI to control samples within the mix. Enjoy.
Yeah, fills sound cool. There was a really interesting spot in, where was it? It's this little post part in the song. Okay, you can hear it right there. Let me turn on the bottom the chain, because Max is doing a roll with one hand and he flips the chain on and off, which I've never heard anyone doing in metal, that's for sure. So that's cool. So when you're doing stuff like that, you want to make sure those details come through, because that's a fun little moment that you don't want to be lost on people. And it's very easy for something like that to get lost. I don't even know if I did any automation. Oh, good. So apparently I got the chain relationship to the snare mix pretty good. And it's not, again, it's not too crazy. There's not too much stuff going on. It's just making sure you're tuned right, making sure you have good mic selection. I like to use, in terms of mic selection for the top, I pretty much always use the Beta 57 these days, because it sounds like a 57, but I think it has a little bit more noise, less, or what we call more noise rejection from cymbals and other things versus a 57. It feels a little bit more isolating to me. And then the bottom, I'm thinking I used a 57 for the bottom, or maybe it was a 609. Let me see if I can tell. I think it's a 57. I could be wrong, but a 57 will work just fine. Okay. So with a snare, I mean, you've probably seen this trick a million times looking at the top snare mic. And okay. So the first thing I do here, because we talked about making samples of Max's kit, just to give ambience, because I'm not using room mics here. The room that I record drums in here is quite a bit smaller. So I want, the lessons that I learned from my old space is that most of the time I want control, and I really don't care too much about room mics and stuff. And I'd rather just make those myself and have control over them. Like with the King one that you heard, you're like, oh, but that sounds so cool. Yeah, but it's just like a lot of fussing, and it doesn't quite get me exactly what I want, versus having a room that's more deadened and controlled and sound dampened, and then augmenting it with samples that I make, or maybe I use from a drum library or something. So the first thing that I'm doing in my chain before I do any EQ on the direct snare mic is adding a audio to MIDI drum trigger. And again, default Reaper plugins. What this is doing is taking the transients of Max's snare and then converting it based on a threshold here into a MIDI note. MIDI note being 38, so that I think that translates to like a D2, I think, which is usually what most sampling programs use for the snare. So I'll listen to it, and then I'll kind of adjust this open and close threshold to get most things. Let's see. So I'm running an in out here, right? I'm running it from here we go, from 182. There's two. I'm running to two different channels, to snare big verb and snare verb. So I'm guessing that what I'm doing with that is, because it's there's two, one for bigger moments and one for just more general kind of stuff. Yeah, right. You know what I mean? It's sending a lot to that. And okay, so that's sending to another channel with the let's just take a look at that. I don't want to skip over some of these details too fast for you guys, for everybody. Okay, so we have let me just double check this. We have the snare big verb, which is, like I said, taken from the snare top mic. And the reason I do that before any EQ or any compression is I'm going to be EQing this thing, and I'm going to be compressing this thing the way over the course of recording. I kind of mix and master as I go, as I'm tracking the band every day. Sometimes in the morning, I'll show up a little bit early and just tweak things. And every day I kind of tweak things. to the point so that by the time let's say Tallah was here for about a month, when they left, the mix that they got was, I would say, 90% to the final mix. And I like to work in that way because I'm in that mind space. So the reason I like to put this MIDI thing in front of the EQ, because that's going to affect, right, how much it's going, the threshold. If I compress it, it's going to mess up with how this trigger thing reacts. So as long as I do that afterwards, I can do all the EQing I want, and it's not going to affect this the MIDI firing. And then afterwards, I have a velocity control. What do you call it? Modifier, I guess, just to kind of keep the dynamics. It's almost like, what would you consider this? Maybe like a MIDI compressor, I suppose. Yeah, it's just a simple tool to give it a little bit more velocity, and that's what it looks like it's going on here. Yeah, just to get a little more stank, because sometimes it's a little bit all over the place, and I want it to be a little more consistent going out. Okay, so let me just double check exactly where this is routing. We have our in outs, and it's sent to 182 and 185. Okay, so let's scroll up. 182 is this. Okay. So this is Reaper's built-in sampler. It's so simple. It's just you essentially import a WAV file, and you just set the parameters. It's there's not to me it's easier to use than something like a Contact, a bit of software. It's just straightforward. If you know how to read numbers and you know what these terms mean, straight to the point. And looks like I have a bunch of different velocities. Oh, there's some Lorna Shore stuff in a different directory. Okay. So anyhow, snare one glued. There's a way to show multiple. Well, I don't want to accidentally go into some directories I shouldn't be. But anyhow, so you load the samples in here essentially, and you set some parameters in terms of your minimum or maximum velocity, what kind of dynamic range you want, volumes, your note range, all this kind of stuff. It's kind of straightforward as long as you know about what these different things, you can assign different MIDI channels, tack, release, pitch, offset. It's really nice. It really gives you a lot of stuff and no fluff. So that's that. Okay, so that's the big verb. And then we also have, what does it go to? 185. What is this one? Okay, so this is like another version of this sample, it seems like. It's interesting. Even something that I did about, we're in February. Yeah, this is about a year ago that I did this. I don't know. You know what I mean? I'm still learning stuff, and it's fun opening these back up. And I'm like, oh, okay. So there's a bunch of different versions of instances of this sampler that it's, I think, cycling through like round robin to play, just to give it a different, so it's not just donk, 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 the same exact sample. Okay. So I think the big one, this one here, is a little bit more processed. You can just see by the waveform, right? There's a bit more of a tail to it. And in this one, it's a little bit more short. This is your everyday room reverb. Whereas the big verb is, something that just adds a little bit more stank to it. Okay, so that's something that we do when I make a sample like that. And I was talking about like beating the hell out of his snare with a rake. That's something we'll do after we've recorded everything, because you can damage heads and maybe you'll even damage the snare doing stupid stuff like that. But that's what we'll like when I record samples of drummers' drums this way. And we'll get ridiculous with it. Like we'll just run at the snare and hit it as hard as we can. In no way when you're playing in front of drums can you get that amount of velocity, but that's what we want. We want it over the top. So we'll wait until after we're done recording everything else. Okay, so that's okay. So that's the chain, right? Starting from the top. So let's go into old drums preamp. Why do I have that in there? Okay, I'll tell you why I have that in there, because this has nothing to do. I'm assuming this is bypassed, right? So it's wet 0. I suppose you could put it as a bypass. But what I'm doing with this 610 preamp here is giving the snare that they recorded earlier. It was like a year or so before we did these, and trying to bring them into the same realm. So looking at these snares, look at mine, and it's just a straight bar across because that Neve is just clipping out at the top end. Okay, and you look at the snares they record elsewhere. Wow, they are all over the place. So what I'm doing,
it's a pretty big contrast.
Yes. So what I'm trying to do with this preamp is kind of do the same thing I'm doing with my knee, right? Clipping the top end and kind of, you know, nipping it in the butt, you know, to get it to a similar place. Because so we can scoot over here. Let's hear how close this snare is. Okay, so since this is in the same channel, I'm also triggering this MIDI thing. I'm surprised you do any automation between the two now that I'm looking at it, right? Because you see how crazy different these waveforms are. I'm surprised that works as well as it does. Listening back, because these are very different waveforms and recordings. But let's just first split second, let's just get rid of this the effects. Okay, it's really ringy. Let's go back to mine. A little bit lower tune, but it's the same snare. You know what I mean? And it's on their first EP. All of Max's drums were like sample replaced. So, and they sound like typical metalcore, big, bombastic, fat snare, and your kick and your toms, all that kind of stuff was exactly what you think of when you think of generic metalcore drum processing. And that's something he was just not interested in. So going back to their old EP and remixing it was kind of cool. It's like, you know, seeing those old paintings get restored on YouTube and like, oh, that's what my drum sounded like. Yeah. So I'm trying to bring them into a spot that matches the things that I record. So that's the reason I have this this preamp on there, but I have it bypassed for all the songs that we did, and then I bring it into play when it comes time to mix the EP to match our recordings. And okay, since we're here, look at this. You can see there's a little sample section where I'll make samples just in case I need to replace a hit. If like a stick hits a rim accidentally and it doesn't sound good, we have different things to choose from. And I can also see something I do when we record. Another reason I like to record these samples of the snare, and you'll see there's toms here too, is to double check the tuning. So I'll be like, okay, we finished, maybe we recorded for like half an hour. I'm like, okay, I'll play this. And then Max will hit a snare and I'll record that. And you can see there's multiple recordings going on here. I was checking the tuning there. And how's this one? A little different. And sometimes I'm like, you know what? It suits the song. Who cares? F it. Let's just roll with it. But it's nice to have those samples there as a check to make sure your drums are still in tune with themselves. And so that if you did a song at a certain tuning, let's say, and then later you want to punch in a fill, if it's drastically different, it might sound distracting in a bad way. So this is a section of my project where I have a bunch of you know, different samples that if a splash didn't quite come through enough, I can layer that in there. So I'll just build that into the session. Okay, so then we have the preamp there to match my psychotic way of driving preamps. And then we have, your old trusty Pro Am B, just as a gate, as a smart equalized gate to get rid of bleed as much as possible. Let's just hear some of that. Get rid of that room sound just so we can hear it a little clearer. So you can see that it's ducking down about 10 dB, right? Let's take it off just to hear it for a second. In this particular context, you're probably not going to hear too much of a difference because I'm guessing once I get to the overall bus of it, I'm probably going ballistic with the compressor to bring out more ring. And if you're doing that, you're also bringing out more bleed. So in this particular case, if you are just listening to this by itself and you're like, oh, this isn't doing much. Well, wait till we get to the compressing side of things. When I turn this back on, you'll probably hear it a lot more. Whoa, right? Let's turn that off. Yeah, definitely noticeable, right? But there still is some bleed. I'm not too concerned about like, oh my God, I got to get rid of all the bleed. And I've been through that mindset and it just ends up not sounding right. And you have to kind of lean into it a little bit. And it's okay because the sound of a China sounds pretty cool coming through the snare. But anyhow, let's go to let's go to the overall bust. And before we do that, actually, let's take a look at the bottom snare mic. Flip the phase. Be careful. Gotta make sure that you punch that a few times for good luck. And then, okay, old drums EQ is the first thing that's on here. It looks like it's just a volume compensation because let's take a look. I'm going to guess these are a lot louder. Yes, they are considerably, quite a bit more. So this is just a volume compensation to get the bottom snare mic to match the old EP's recording. So that's just there. It's bypassed, as you can see here. And then I engage it for the rest of the record and the rest of the session. Next thing is just some EQ, just boosting a bunch around 5K to get that snap out of it, or into it, I should say. Let me just hear some of this. Okay, and I also have this Pro MB as another gate scenario. I listen to it by itself and I think to myself, I like it. I like how it sounds better when I'm soloing it without the gate. But of course, with everything in context, this might start bringing in some frequencies down here that you don't want to hear once everything. And again, like I was talking about spice building up. Yeah, these frequencies get spicy and they start building. You hear it by itself. If you're too zoomed in, you're not going to make the correct decision. So you have to hear the whole kit together, and then also together with the entire mix, because there might be some sibilance up here in the vocals. There might be some other in the guitars, whistling frequencies. But anyhow, yeah, that's definitely getting, doing things I don't want it to do. So getting rid of it here still allows a lot of the body of the bottom snare to do its thing and resonate while getting rid of this. Because even like that, again, if I'm listening to it by itself, I like this threshold happening here a little bit more. If the point of the song in this spot was just to hear the bottom snare mic, I'm going to make a very different decision than if the point of it is to be part of a bigger picture. So yeah, by itself, it doesn't sound too great, does it? But it does get the just some more articulation so that I'm not having to boost the top snare mic so much and get myself into problems with cymbal bleed.